The penthouse was a cathedral of silence, its vast emptiness a testament to a life unraveled. Eleanor Vale stood at the edge of her living room, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city's glittering skyline like a distant constellation. The air carried the faint scent of jasmine from a vase on the glass coffee table, a deliberate choice to soften the sterile edge of her surroundings. For the past 18 months, since the ink had dried on her divorce papers from Victor Crestwell, this silence had been her closest companion. It was a stark contrast to the cacophony of her former life, a life filled with Victor's commanding presence, the clink of crystal at endless galas, and the weight of his expectations pressing down on her like a velvet noose. Victor had been a man who consumed space, not just physical space, with his broad shoulders and tailored suits, but emotional space, intellectual space, the very air in a room. He was a tech magnate, a titan whose name was synonymous with innovation and power. Their marriage had been a carefully curated exhibit, a showcase of his success with Eleanor as the elegant, understated accessory. She had played her role well, gracious, poised, the perfect wife to a man who thrived in the spotlight. But when he left her for Cassandra Leigh, a young venture capitalist with a smile as sharp as her ambition, Eleanor had been reduced to a footnote in his narrative, a relic of his past, discarded for a shinier model. The divorce had been swift, clinical, and devastatingly public. Victor had spun a tale of mutual parting, a sad but necessary end to a marriage that, in his words, couldn't keep pace with his vision. The tabloids ate it up, painting Eleanor as the quiet, fragile wife who couldn't handle the demands of Victor's world. Cassandra, meanwhile, was the future, bold, dynamic, a perfect match for his relentless drive. The world saw them as a power couple, a beacon of modern success. Eleanor saw a mirror of her own erasure. Tonight, the silence in her penthouse felt heavier than usual, charged with a quiet anticipation. On the sleek black chaise lounge lay a gown, a deep emerald creation that shimmered like a forest under moonlight. It was a custom piece from a designer whose work was a whispered legend among the elite. Beside it sat an invitation, its cream cardstock embossed with silver lettering, the Crestwood Foundation Gala, an event she and Victor had once hosted together, a glittering affair where power and philanthropy collided in a dazzling display of wealth. This year, she had no reason to attend. No reason, except the quiet voice in her head, her therapist's voice, Dr. Lena Hart, urging her to step back into the world she had fled. "It's not about them, Eleanor," Dr. Hart had said during their last session, her voice steady through the phone. "It's about you, reclaiming your space, your story. You can't hide forever, even if the hiding feels safe." Eleanor traced her fingers along the edge of the invitation, the paper cool and smooth against her skin. Dr. Hart called it exposure therapy, but to Eleanor, it felt like stepping into a battlefield dressed in silk. The gala was a lion's den, filled with the same faces that had once smiled at her, then turned away when her marriage crumbled. The same faces that had whispered about her fragility, her failure. And Victor would be there, with Cassandra on his arm, basking in the glow of their curated perfection. She walked to the window, the city sprawling beneath her like a sea of fractured jewels. The past year had been a slow, deliberate act of rebuilding. She had taken up painting, finding solace in the unpredictable swirls of color on canvas. She had reconnected with old friends, their warmth a reminder of a life before Victor. She had even started sketching a business plan, a small, defiant dream of opening an art gallery, a space to showcase the work of emerging artists. Victor would have scoffed at it, called it a quaint distraction. But it was hers, a seed of purpose planted in the ruins of her old life. The gala was a test. Could she walk into that world again, the one that had discarded her, and hold her ground? Could she face Victor, the man who had shared her life for 12 years, and not crumble under the weight of memory? Could she look at Cassandra, with her polished beauty and calculated charm, and not feel the sting of replacement? A memory flickered, sharp and unwelcome. 3 years ago, at this very gala, she had worn a pale gold dress, delicate and ethereal, chosen to please Victor. He had complimented her, his eyes already scanning the room for the next handshake, the next deal. Later that night, he had closed a multi-million-dollar partnership, his energy electric, unstoppable. He had pulled her into a quiet corner, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that felt more like a victory lap than an act of love. "We're unstoppable, Ellie," he'd said, as if she had been in the boardroom with him. She had felt like a prop then, a beautiful object to be admired and set aside. She looked at the emerald gown again. It was not delicate or ethereal. It was bold, commanding, a statement of presence. Tonight, she would not be a prop. She would not be a ghost. She would be Eleanor Vale, a woman stepping out of the shadows of her own story. Taking a deep breath, she felt the silence shift. It was no longer a weight, but a canvas, vast and ready to be filled. The city lights blurred into a mosaic of possibility, and for the first time in months, Eleanor felt a spark of defiance. She would go to the gala, not for Victor, not for Cassandra, not even for Dr. Hart. She would go for herself, to see if the woman she was becoming could face the woman she had been. The mirror in Eleanor's dressing room was a full-length expanse of polished glass, reflecting her image with unflinching clarity. She stood before it, the emerald gown clinging to her frame like a second skin, its deep green hue catching the soft glow of the chandelier above. The dress was a masterpiece, sleeveless, with a plunging neckline that was daring yet elegant, and a fitted bodice that flowed into a cascade of fabric at her hips. Tiny hand-stitched sequins shimmered like fireflies, catching the light with every subtle movement. It was not the kind of dress Victor would have chosen for her. He preferred her in softer shades, ivory, blush, colors that made her blend into the background of his world. This dress demanded attention, and Eleanor wasn't sure if she was ready to carry its weight. Her hair, a cascade of dark auburn, was swept into an intricate updo, revealing the slender curve of her neck and the simple diamond studs that had been her mother's. Her makeup was understated but deliberate, a touch of smoky shadow to accentuate her hazel eyes, a sweep of mascara, and a bold red lip that felt like a declaration of war. She studied her reflection, searching for the woman she had been. Ellie Crestwell, the quiet wife who smiled on cue and never made waves. That woman was gone, or at least buried deep beneath layers of resilience and reinvention. The woman in the mirror was Eleanor Vale, and she was a stranger, beautiful, formidable, and a little terrifying. The invitation to the Crestwood Foundation Gala sat on the vanity, its silver lettering glinting like a challenge. Eleanor had attended this event for years, first as Victor's fiancée, then as his wife, always playing the role of the gracious co-host. She had organized seating charts, vetted menus, and ensured every detail was flawless, all while Victor took center stage, charming donors and sealing deals. Tonight, she was just a guest, an outsider in a world she had once shaped. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, equal parts dread and exhilaration. She picked up a small velvet box from the vanity, opening it to reveal a delicate silver bracelet, a gift from her college friend Margot, given to her after the divorce. "Wear it when you need to feel brave," Margot had said, her voice warm with encouragement. Eleanor fastened it around her wrist, the cool metal a grounding presence. She needed all the courage she could muster tonight, not just to face Victor and Cassandra, but to face the whispers, the pity, the inevitable comparisons. She could already imagine the headlines in tomorrow's society pages. Eleanor Vale makes stunning return at Crestwood Gala. Or worse, Victor Crestwell's ex-wife attempts comeback. The thought made her stomach churn. Her phone buzzed, breaking the spell of her thoughts. It was a text from Margot. "Knock 'em dead, Elle. You're a queen, and they don't deserve you." A smile tugged at Eleanor's lips, the warmth of her friend's words cutting through the anxiety. Margot had been one of the few constants in her life after the divorce, dragging her out for coffee, inviting her to art gallery openings, refusing to let her disappear into the silence of her penthouse. It was Margot who had introduced her to painting, who had sat with her through late-night tears, who had reminded her that she was more than Victor Crestwell's wife. Eleanor typed a quick reply. "Thanks, Em. I'll try not to trip in these heels, and set the phone down." She took one last look in the mirror, squaring her shoulders. The gown was her armor, the bracelet her talisman, and the invitation her battle cry. She was ready, or as ready as she could be. The drive to the Crestwood Hotel was a blur of city lights and the low hum of the car's engine. Her driver, a quiet man named Henry who had worked for her since her marriage, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You look radiant, Miss Vale," he said, his voice soft but sincere. Eleanor smiled, grateful for the small kindness. "Thank you, Henry. Let's hope I can keep it together in there." The hotel loomed ahead, a grand edifice of marble and glass that radiated old-world opulence. Its facade was lit with golden light, and a red carpet stretched from the entrance to the street, where valets in crisp uniforms ushered guests from sleek black cars. Eleanor's heart began to pound as Henry pulled up to the curb. The moment was here, and there was no turning back. She stepped out of the car, the cool night air brushing against her bare shoulders. Cameras flashed, a sudden burst of light that made her blink. The paparazzi were a fixture of the Crestwood Gala, always hungry for a glimpse of the city's elite. Eleanor kept her chin high, her movements deliberate as she walked up the carpet. She could feel eyes on her, valets, photographers, other guests pausing to whisper behind their hands. She heard a murmur, faint but unmistakable. "Is that Eleanor Vale? My God, she looks different." The lobby was a symphony of wealth, crystal chandeliers casting prisms of light, marble floors polished to a mirror sheen, and the soft clink of champagne glasses. Eleanor handed her invitation to an attendant, who gave her a polite nod and gestured toward the grand staircase leading to the ballroom. Each step felt like a descent into the unknown, her heels clicking against the marble like a metronome counting down to battle. At the top of the stairs, the ballroom doors stood open, revealing a sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. The air was thick with the scent of orchids and expensive cologne, and a string quartet played a delicate melody that floated above the hum of conversation. For a moment, Eleanor stood frozen, the sheer weight of the room pressing against her. This was her old world, a place where she had once been a queen. Now, she felt like an intruder, a ghost slipping through the cracks of a life she no longer owned. She took a deep breath, the emerald gown catching the light as she stepped forward. Heads turned, a subtle ripple of recognition spreading through the crowd. She saw the flicker of surprise in their eyes, the quick calculations. Eleanor Vale, the ex-wife. What is she doing here? She forced herself to keep moving, her posture straight, her expression calm. She would not let them see her falter. At the bar, she ordered a glass of Prosecco, the bubbles a sharp contrast to the knot in her stomach. She scanned the room, a habit from her years as Victor's wife, cataloging faces, a hedge fund manager laughing too loudly, a philanthropist adjusting her diamond necklace, a politician shaking hands with a tech mogul. It was a familiar constellation, a map she had once navigated with ease. But tonight, every glance felt like a potential minefield. "Eleanor, my goodness, is that you?" The voice was warm, familiar, cutting through the noise. She turned to see Beatrice Langston, a woman who had served on the Crestwood Foundation board with her years ago. Beatrice was in her late 50s, with silver hair swept into an elegant chignon and a navy gown that spoke of understated power. Her eyes were wide with genuine surprise, tinged with something else. Admiration, perhaps. "Beatrice," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's been too long. Far too long," Beatrice replied, stepping closer. She looked Eleanor up and down, her gaze lingering on the emerald gown. "You look absolutely stunning, my dear. I heard you'd left the city, gone off to some quiet retreat. Clearly, the rumors were wrong." Eleanor smiled, a small, practiced curve of her lips. "I've been finding my way," she said simply. "But I couldn't miss the gala. It's for a good cause." Beatrice's eyes twinkled with mischief, and perhaps a chance to remind certain people that you're still a force to be reckoned with. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They're here, you know. Victor and that woman." Eleanor's grip on her glass tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I expected they would be," she said, taking a sip of Prosecco. The bubbles stung her tongue, grounding her. "It's their world, after all." "Not tonight," Beatrice said, her voice firm. "Tonight, it's yours. Look at you, Eleanor. You're not just here, you're commanding the room." She gestured subtly to the crowd, where heads were still turning, whispers spreading like wildfire. "If you need an ally, you know where to find me. I've navigated a few of these battles myself." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest, a flicker of gratitude. "Thank you, Beatrice. I'll keep that in mind." As Beatrice moved off to greet another guest, Eleanor felt a shift within her. She wasn't just a ghost haunting her old life. She was a woman with a presence, with allies, with a story that was still being written. She straightened, her emerald gown shimmering as she stepped further into the ballroom, ready to face whatever, or whoever, came next. The ballroom pulsed with a rhythm all its own, a choreography of wealth and influence set to the delicate strains of the string quartet. Eleanor moved through the crowd, her emerald gown a beacon in the sea of jewel tones and black tuxedos. The Prosecco in her hand was a prop, something to hold on to as she navigated the familiar, yet treacherous terrain of the Crestwood Gala. Every step felt like a performance, every glance a test. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, some curious, some admiring, others laced with the sharp edge of judgment. She was no longer Victor Crestwell's wife, but she was not yet fully Eleanor Vale, either. She was something in between, a woman in the act of becoming. She paused near a towering floral arrangement, its orchids and lilies spilling over like a frozen waterfall. The scent reminded her of her own jasmine-filled penthouse, a small anchor to her new life. She scanned the room, her gaze practiced and deliberate, a skill honed from years of standing at Victor's side. She noted the clusters of power, a media mogul holding court by the grand piano, a fashion designer whispering to a socialite, a venture capitalist gesturing animatedly to a group of investors. It was a world she knew intimately, yet it felt foreign now, as if she were a visitor in a museum of her own past. And then she saw them. They were across the room, near the stage where the quartet played, their presence as commanding as ever. Victor Crestwell stood tall, his charcoal tuxedo tailored to perfection, accentuating the broad lines of his shoulders. His dark hair was flecked with silver now, a detail that only added to his aura of authority. He was smiling, his head tilted toward the woman on his arm, Cassandra Leigh. She was a vision in a crimson gown that clung to her like a flame, its bold color a stark contrast to Eleanor's emerald. Her blonde hair fell in sleek waves, her makeup a study in precision, every feature sharpened to convey ambition and allure. They were a perfect tableau, a power couple crafted for the society pages, their every gesture calculated to project invincibility. Eleanor's heart stuttered, a quick, painful lurch that she forced herself to ignore. She had known they would be here, had prepared for this moment in countless therapy sessions and sleepless nights. Yet seeing them in the flesh, Victor's easy confidence, Cassandra's predatory grace, was like a blade slipping beneath her carefully constructed armor. For a moment, she was back in the penthouse she had shared with Victor, watching him pack a suitcase for a business trip that she later learned was a weekend with Cassandra. The memory stung, but she refused to let it take root. As if drawn by some invisible thread, Victor's gaze lifted, scanning the room with the casual arrogance of a man who owned it. His eyes found hers, and for a split second, the world seemed to freeze. The smile on his lips faltered, his posture stiffening, as if he'd been struck. Eleanor saw the shock in his expression, raw and unfiltered, before he masked it with the practiced ease of a man used to controlling every situation. Beside him, Cassandra followed his gaze, her lips tightening into a thin, glossy line. Her blue eyes, usually so full of calculated charm, hardened into something colder, something that spoke of possession and threat. Eleanor held their stares, her chin high, her expression a careful mask of polite indifference. She would not flinch. She would not run. The Prosecco flute in her hand felt like a lifeline, its cool glass grounding her as she stood her ground. The whispers around her grew louder, a soft hum of speculation that rippled through the crowd. Is that Eleanor Vale? She's back. She looks different. Victor murmured something to Cassandra, his hand resting lightly on her lower back, a gesture Eleanor knew all too well. It was possessive, a silent claim of dominance. They began to move toward her, a slow, deliberate approach that felt like a predator stalking prey. Cassandra's smile was a brittle thing, a veneer of confidence that didn't quite reach her eyes. Victor's face was a study in control, but Eleanor caught the flicker of unease in his gaze, a crack in his carefully curated facade. Her first instinct was to retreat, to slip into the crowd and disappear. But then she thought of Dr. Hart's words. You're not running from them, Eleanor. You're running toward yourself. She thought of Margot's text, of Beatrice's offer of alliance, of the bracelet on her wrist. She was not the woman Victor had left, the one who had cried herself to sleep in an empty bed. She was Eleanor Vale, and she was done hiding. She took a slow sip of Prosecco, the bubbles sharp and bright on her tongue, and turned to face them as they approached. Her heart pounded, a wild rhythm against her ribs, but her expression remained serene, her posture unshakable. She would meet them on her terms, not theirs. Eleanor, Victor said, his voice a smooth baritone that once had the power to unravel her. Now it sounded hollow, like an echo from a life she no longer lived. I didn't expect to see you here. His words were polite, but there was an edge to them, a subtle challenge. Eleanor met his gaze directly, her hazel eyes steady. Victor, she replied, her voice calm and measured. The Crestwood Gala has always been a worthy cause. I thought it was time to show my support again. Her eyes drifted to Cassandra, who stood slightly behind Victor, her crimson gown a vivid contrast to the room's softer hues. Cassandra, Eleanor said, her tone neutral but firm. You look radiant. It was a calculated move, a way to acknowledge Cassandra without giving her the power she so clearly craved. Eleanor knew this game. She had played it for years at Victor's side. Cassandra's smile tightened, her eyes flashing with a mix of irritation and competitiveness. Eleanor, she said, her voice syrupy with false warmth. It's so good to see you out and about. We were worried you'd retreated. The we was a deliberate jab, a way of aligning herself with Victor, of painting Eleanor as the outsider. The worried was pure condescension, a reminder of the narrative Victor had spun, the fragile ex-wife, left behind by a world that moved too fast. Eleanor felt a spark of anger, but she smothered it, letting her lips curve into a faint, enigmatic smile. Thank you for your concern, she said, her voice as smooth as silk. But I'm doing quite well, just exploring new horizons. An awkward silence fell, heavy with the weight of unspoken history. Victor shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the crowd as if gauging who was watching. And they were watching. Heads turned, whispers grew, a subtle shift in the room's energy. Eleanor could feel it, a current of curiosity and intrigue that placed her at its center. For the first time in years, she was not Victor's shadow. She was the story. Well, Victor said, his tone clipped as he tried to regain control. It's good to see you looking healthy. The word was a misstep, patronizing and clumsy, and Eleanor caught the flicker of annoyance in Cassandra's eyes. Victor was faltering, and they both knew it. Healthy, Eleanor repeated, letting the word linger in the air. Her smile widened, a spark of defiance in her eyes. I'd say thriving, Victor. It's amazing what a little freedom can do. The word freedom landed like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples through the tension between them. It was a direct challenge to Victor's narrative, a declaration that she was not the broken woman he had left behind. Cassandra's hand tightened on Victor's arm, her nails digging into the fabric of his tuxedo. We're so happy for you, she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. It must be such a relief to move on. Eleanor tilted her head, her gaze steady. It is, she said simply, but I won't keep you. I'm sure you have important people to charm. With a polite nod, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking with quiet authority. She didn't look back, but she could feel their eyes on her, a mixture of shock and resentment burning into her back. As she moved through the crowd, the whispers grew louder, a chorus of speculation and admiration. She had faced the king and his new queen, and she had not only survived, she had claimed the moment. The emerald gown shimmered as she walked, a symbol of her rebirth, and for the first time that night, Eleanor felt the weight of eyes not as a burden, but as a crown. The ballroom's energy had shifted, a subtle but undeniable undercurrent that pulsed through the crowd like a heartbeat. Eleanor felt it as she walked away from Victor and Cassandra, her emerald gown catching the light with every step. The whispers followed her, a soft crescendo of intrigue that wrapped around her like a cloak. She had expected to feel fragile, exposed, but instead, There was a spark of exhilaration, a quiet thrill that came from standing her ground. She had faced the man who had once defined her world and the woman who had taken her place, and she had not crumbled. She had emerged. She made her way to a quieter corner of the room, near a set of arched windows that overlooked the hotel's manicured gardens. The glass was cool against her fingertips as she leaned against it, her Prosecco flute still clutched in her other hand. The bubbles had gone flat, but she didn't care. She needed a moment to breathe, to let the adrenaline coursing through her veins settle. The encounter had been a test, and she had passed, but the effort had left her trembling beneath her composed exterior. It was one thing to rehearse this moment with Dr. Hart, to imagine the words she would say. It was another to stand in the glare of Victor's gaze and not flinch. "Eleanor." That was masterful. The voice was warm, tinged with amusement, and it pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Julian Harper, a renowned art curator whose work she had admired during her years as Victor's wife. He was in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a kind, weathered face that spoke of a life spent chasing beauty. His tuxedo was slightly less formal than the others, a navy jacket with a subtle plaid pattern that suggested confidence in his own style. "Julian," Eleanor said, her voice softening with genuine warmth. "I didn't expect to see you here, and I didn't expect to see you steal the show," he replied, his eyes twinkling. He gestured toward the center of the ballroom, where Victor and Cassandra were now mingling with a group of investors, their smiles strained. That little exchange was the talk of the room. "You've got them rattled, and it's a beautiful thing to watch." Eleanor laughed, a small, surprise sound that felt like a release. "I didn't set out to rattle anyone," she said, though the spark in her eyes suggested otherwise. "I just wanted to be here. For myself." Julian nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And that's exactly why you've got everyone's attention. You're not playing their game. You're rewriting the rules." He took a sip of his drink, an amber liquid that caught the light. "I saw your work at the Children's Hospital benefit a few years back. The way you curated that collection, mixing emerging artists with established names, it was bold, unconventional. I've been meaning to tell you that for years." Eleanor's breath caught, a flush of warmth spreading through her chest. The hospital benefit had been one of her proudest moments, a rare instance where Victor had let her take the lead. She had spent months selecting pieces, working with artists, crafting a narrative through art that spoke of hope and resilience. Victor had called it charming, a dismissive word that had stung at the time. To hear Julian, a man whose opinion carried weight in the art world, acknowledge it now felt like a validation she hadn't realized she needed. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter now. "That means more than you know." Julian tilted his head, studying her. "You've got a gift, Eleanor. I'm working on a new project, a gallery space for underrepresented artists. We're looking for someone to help shape the vision, someone with an eye for what's real, not just what's trendy. I'd love for you to take a look at the plans, maybe offer some input." The offer hung in the air, unexpected and exhilarating. It was more than a compliment. It was a door opening, a chance to reclaim a part of herself she had buried under Victor's ambitions. I'd be honored," she stammered, her composure faltering for the first time that night. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," Julian said, his smile kind but firm. "No pressure, just a chance to do something extraordinary." Before she could respond, the quartet's music shifted, transitioning into a slow, soulful waltz. The crowd began to move toward the dance floor, couples pairing off in a graceful ritual. Julian set his glass on a nearby table and extended his hand. "Care to dance?" he asked, his tone light but sincere. "I promise I won't step on your toes." Eleanor hesitated, her heart still racing from the encounter with Victor and Cassandra. The idea of stepping onto the dance floor, of being seen in such a public, vulnerable way, was daunting. But then she thought of the woman she was becoming, the woman who had walked into this gala, who had faced her past without flinching. She set her Prosecco flute down and took Julian's hand, her fingers steady despite the flutter in her chest. "I'd love to," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. As they moved to the dance floor, Eleanor felt the weight of eyes again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't pity or judgment. It was curiosity, respect, perhaps even envy. Julian was a skilled dancer, his movements fluid and confident, guiding her with a gentle hand on her back. The emerald gown swirled around her, its sequins catching the light like a constellation brought to life. For the first time that night, Eleanor let herself feel the music, let it carry her away from the tension and the memories. Across the room, Victor watched, his jaw tightening as he gripped his champagne flute. Cassandra stood beside him, her crimson gown a stark contrast to the muted elegance of the crowd. Her smile was frozen, her eyes narrowed as she followed Eleanor's graceful movements. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice low and sharp, barely masking her irritation. "Julian Harper," Victor replied, his tone clipped. "Art curator. Nobody important." The lie was evident in the way his eyes lingered on Eleanor, the way his fingers tightened around his glass. Julian was respected, influential in his own right, and his attention to Eleanor was a public statement, one that Victor hadn't anticipated. "She's making a spectacle of herself," Cassandra said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Dancing with him like that, after everything. It's pathetic." Victor didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Eleanor wasn't pathetic. She was radiant, a woman who had walked into his world and turned it upside down with nothing more than her presence. He had expected her to fade away, to retreat into the shadows of their divorce. Instead, she was here, commanding the room, rewriting the narrative he had so carefully crafted, and it stung more than he cared to admit. Eleanor felt Victor's gaze, a prickling awareness on her skin, but she didn't look at him. She focused on Julian, on the music, on the feeling of moving through the world without apology. "You're a natural," Julian said, his voice warm as he spun her gently. "You make it look effortless." "It doesn't feel effortless," she admitted, a small laugh escaping her lips. "But it feels good. That's the spirit," he said, his smile widening. "You're not just surviving tonight, Eleanor. You're thriving." As the waltz ended, the crowd erupted into polite applause, and Eleanor felt a rush of something she hadn't felt in years: pride. She had stepped onto the dance floor, not as Victor's ex-wife, but as herself, and the room had noticed. Julian led her off the floor, his hand still a steady presence at her back. "You're going to be the talk of the town tomorrow," he said, his tone teasing but kind. "I hope you're ready for it." "I'm not sure I am," Eleanor replied, but there was a lightness in her voice, a spark of possibility. She glanced across the room, catching Victor's eye for a fleeting moment. His expression was unreadable, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped Cassandra's arm. For the first time, she didn't feel like the one out of place. She felt like the one in control. The Crestwood Gala was a meticulously crafted illusion, a stage where the city's elite played their roles with practiced ease. But as Eleanor stepped off the dance floor with Julian Harper, she could sense the cracks forming in the evening's polished veneer. The whispers had grown bolder, the glances less discreet. Her presence, her defiance, had shifted the room's gravity, pulling attention away from Victor Crestwell and his carefully curated world. Eleanor felt it in the air, a charged undercurrent that made her skin prickle with both triumph and unease. Julian guided her toward a cluster of high-top tables near the edge of the ballroom, where a few guests lingered over cocktails and canapes. His hand was a steady anchor at her elbow, a quiet gesture of support that grounded her. "You're holding court tonight," he said, his voice low and warm. "I don't think they know what to make of you." Eleanor managed a small smile, though her heart still raced from the dance. "I'm not sure I know what to make of myself," she admitted, her fingers brushing the silver bracelet on her wrist. "But I'm here, and that's something." "It's more than something," Julian replied, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity that caught her off guard. "It's a statement. You're not just here, Eleanor. You're rewriting the story they thought they knew." Before she could respond, a familiar figure approached, her navy gown cutting through the crowd with the authority of a battleship. Beatrice Langston's silver hair gleamed under the chandeliers, and her sharp eyes were alight with mischief. "Eleanor, my dear," she said, her voice ringing with approval. "That dance was a masterstroke. You've got the entire room buzzing like a hive of very well-dressed bees." Eleanor laughed, the sound lighter than she expected. "I didn't mean to cause a stir," she said, though the spark in her eyes suggested she wasn't entirely sorry. "I just wanted to be here." "Oh, you're more than here," Beatrice said, waving a hand dismissively. "You're a revelation. And you've got certain people looking like they've swallowed a lemon." She tilted her head toward the far side of the room, where Victor and Cassandra stood with a group of investors. Victor's smile was tight, his posture rigid, while Cassandra's crimson gown seemed to pulse with her barely contained frustration. Eleanor followed Beatrice's gaze, her stomach tightening. Victor was watching her, his dark eyes narrowed, assessing. Cassandra's hand was on his arm, her grip possessive, but her smile was a brittle mask, her eyes darting between Victor and the crowd. The power couple, so flawless in their public image, was unraveling, and Eleanor could feel the weight of their discomfort like a tangible force. "Let them stew," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They underestimated you, and now they're paying the price. Come, I want you to meet someone." She linked her arm through Eleanor's, steering her toward a small group of women gathered near the silent auction table. "These are the real power brokers in this room, and they've been dying to talk to you." Eleanor hesitated, the instinct to retreat still lingering. But Beatrice's grip was firm, her presence a reminder that she wasn't alone. She allowed herself to be led, her emerald gown shimmering as she moved through the crowd. The women turned as they approached, their expressions a mix of surprise and genuine warmth. Eleanor recognized them, philanthropists, board members, women who had once been her peers in the world of charity and influence. They had sent polite notes after her divorce, then faded into silence, respecting the narrative of her fragility. Now, they looked at her with something new, respect. "Eleanor," said Margaret Voss, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who chaired the city's largest arts foundation. "You look absolutely radiant. We were just saying how much we've missed you on the circuit." The other women nodded, their smiles warm but cautious, as if testing the waters. "It's been too long," said Clara Nguyen, a tech heiress who had collaborated with Eleanor on several fundraisers. "We thought you'd left the city for good." Eleanor felt a flush of warmth at their words, but also a pang of sadness. These women had been her allies once, her confidants. But when Victor left, they had retreated, unsure how to navigate the wreckage of her marriage. Now, her presence at the gala, her bold, unapologetic return, had given them permission to reconnect. "I needed some time," Eleanor said, her voice steady but soft. "But I'm here now, and I'm finding my way." "You're doing more than that," Margaret said, her eyes gleaming. "You're reminding us all what grace under pressure looks like. Tell me, what have you been up to?" "I heard a rumor about an art gallery." Eleanor blinked, surprised. The idea of her gallery was still just a sketch, a dream she had shared only with Margot and Dr. Hart. But the interest in Margaret's voice was genuine, and it sparked something in Eleanor, a flicker of possibility. "It's still early days," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But I'm working on a concept for a gallery space, something to showcase emerging artists, people who don't usually get a seat at the table." The women leaned in, their interest palpable. "That's brilliant," Clara said. "The art world needs more voices like that. Have you thought about funding? I know a few people who'd be interested in backing a project like that." Eleanor's heart quickened. This was more than polite conversation. It was an invitation, a chance to step back into a world where she could make a difference. "I'm still in the planning stages," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But I'd love to talk more about it." "Consider it a date," Margaret said, her smile sharp and approving. "We'll have lunch next week. Bring your sketches." As the conversation flowed, Eleanor felt a shift within her. These women weren't just welcoming her back. They were seeing her, not as Victor's ex-wife, but as a woman with ideas, with vision. The pity she had dreaded was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was camaraderie, a shared understanding of what it meant to navigate a world that often dismissed women like them. Across the room, Victor watched the scene unfold, his expression darkening. Cassandra was speaking to a group of young entrepreneurs, her laughter high and forced, but Victor's attention was fixed on Eleanor. She was surrounded now, not just by Julian Harper, but by some of the most influential women in the city. They were laughing, their heads bent together, their body language open and engaged. It was a tableau of power, and Eleanor was at its center. "She's playing a dangerous game," Cassandra hissed, rejoining Victor's side. Her crimson gown seemed to blaze with her irritation, her eyes flashing. "She's making us look like fools." Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. He was used to controlling the narrative, to being the sun around which every orbit revolved. But tonight, Eleanor was the one drawing light, and it was a light he couldn't dim. "She's not playing a game," he said finally, his voice low and cold. "She's just here." "And that's the problem," Cassandra snapped. "She's not supposed to be here. She's supposed to be gone, out of sight, out of mind. But now she's dancing with art curators and charming the board members we need for the next deal. This is a disaster, Victor." He turned to her, his eyes hard. "Then fix it," he said, his voice a low growl. "You're supposed to be the master of spin. Spin this." Cassandra's smile faltered, her composure cracking under the weight of his words. She had built her image on being Victor's perfect partner, the woman who could match his ambition and outshine his past. But Eleanor's presence was a threat she hadn't anticipated, a reminder that the past could not be erased so easily. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp. "I'll handle it. But you'd better be ready to back me up." She turned and strode toward the silent auction table, her crimson gown a slash of defiance against the crowd. Victor watched her go, a cold knot of dread tightening in his chest. He had underestimated Eleanor once, and it had cost him. He wasn't sure he could afford to make the same mistake again. The Crestwood Gala was a delicate ecosystem, a balance of power and pretense maintained by unspoken rules. But as Eleanor Vale stood among the circle of influential women, her emerald gown shimmering under the chandelier's glow, she felt those rules bending, if not breaking. The conversation flowed effortlessly, talk of art, philanthropy, and the future of her gallery project. Yet beneath it, there was a current of something deeper. These women, once distant allies, were now her shield, their laughter and warmth a fortress against the whispers that still lingered in the room. Eleanor felt a flicker of hope, a sense that she was not just surviving this night, but reshaping it. Across the ballroom, Victor Crestwell stood alone for a moment, his champagne flute abandoned on a passing tray. His eyes were fixed on Eleanor, a storm brewing behind his carefully controlled expression. Cassandra had stormed off to handle the situation, but Victor knew better than to trust her impulsiveness. She was a wildfire, brilliant and captivating, but prone to burning everything in her path, including herself. He had chosen her for that fire, for the way she mirrored his own ambition. But now, watching Eleanor command the room with quiet grace, he felt a pang of doubt. Had he miscalculated? Had he underestimated the woman he had left behind? Cassandra, meanwhile, was weaving through the crowd, her crimson gown a vivid streak against the muted elegance of the gala. Her smile was a weapon, sharp and calculated, as she approached the silent auction table where a cluster of young entrepreneurs and influencers stood. She knew this game: charm, distract, redirect. If Eleanor was the story of the night, Cassandra would rewrite it, paint herself as the gracious Victor, the woman who rose above the drama. But as she joined the group, her laughter ringing out a little too loudly, she felt the weight of eyes on her, not admiring, but scrutinizing. The room was no longer hers to control. "Cassandra, darling," said a young tech founder, his tone polite but cool. "We were just talking about the new arts initiative. Eleanor Vale seems to have some fascinating ideas." Cassandra's smile tightened, her eyes flashing with irritation. "Oh, Eleanor's always had her little projects," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's sweet, really, how she's trying to stay relevant." The group exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. One of the women, a social media influencer with a knack for cutting through pretense, raised an eyebrow. "She doesn't seem to be trying anything," she said, her tone neutral but pointed. "She's just doing it." That gallery idea sounded like it could shake things up. Cassandra's laugh was sharp, a brittle sound that didn't quite land. "Well, we'll see how far it goes," she said, her fingers tightening around her clutch. "She's had a tough year, you know. It's nice to see her out, but—" She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. "Eleanor's fragile. She's a pity case." But the group didn't bite. Instead, they turned their attention back to the auction table, their conversation shifting to the next item up for bid. Cassandra stood frozen, her smile faltering. She had misjudged the room, underestimated the shift in its energy. Eleanor wasn't the sad ex-wife anymore. She was a woman with a vision, a presence that demanded attention. And Cassandra's attempt to diminish her had only made her own desperation more apparent. Back near the arched windows, Eleanor was unaware of Cassandra's faltering performance. She was caught up in the conversation with Margaret Voss and Claren Wynne, their enthusiasm for her gallery project igniting something within her. "We could connect you with some artists," Clara was saying, her eyes bright with excitement. "There's a collective in the East End doing incredible work. Mixed media, very raw and authentic. They'd be perfect for your vision." "I'd love that," Eleanor said, her voice steady but warm. "I want a gallery to be a space for stories that don't usually get told. Artists who've been overlooked, who have something real to say." Margaret nodded, her sharp eyes softening with approval. "That's what this city needs," she said. "Something honest. Something that isn't just chasing trends or egos." She glanced across the room, her gaze landing briefly on Victor and Cassandra. "Unlike some." Eleanor followed her glance, her heart giving a small lurch as she caught Victor's eye again. He was moving now, cutting through the crowd with a purpose that set her nerves on edge. She recognized that walk, the deliberate stride of a man who refused to lose control. He was coming for her, and the realization sent a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. "Eleanor," Beatrice said, her voice low and urgent as she noticed Victor's approach. "Looks like the king has decided to grace us with his presence. Do you want me to run interference?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the silver bracelet for strength. "No," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I can handle him." Beatrice raised an eyebrow, a spark of admiration in her eyes. "That's my girl," she said, stepping back to give Eleanor space. Margaret and Clara exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of curiosity and support. They, too, stepped back, forming a subtle but protective circle around her. Victor reached her, his presence as commanding as ever, though there was a crack in his usual confidence, a slight tightening of his jaw, a flicker of unease in his dark eyes. "Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something she couldn't quite place. "Can we talk? Privately?" The request was a power move, a way to pull her away from her allies, to reassert his dominance. Eleanor felt the old instinct to comply, to smooth things over, to make him comfortable. But she wasn't that woman anymore. "Here is fine," she said, her tone polite but unyielding. "What's on your mind, Victor?" His eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation breaking through his composure. He hadn't expected resistance, not from her. "I just thought we could catch up," he said, his voice lowering to a more intimate tone, as if they were still the couple who had shared quiet moments over coffee. "It's been a while." Eleanor's smile was small, controlled. "It has," she agreed, "but I'm not sure there's much to catch up on. We've both moved on, haven't we?" The words were a quiet challenge, a reminder that she was no longer his to control. Victor's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she saw the man he had become, a man who thrived on power, who couldn't bear to lose it. "You seem different," he said, his tone careful, probing. "This gallery thing, it's a big step." "It is," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "It's something I've been wanting to do for a long time. I'm finally getting the chance to make it happen." Victor's smile was tight, almost patronizing. "That's ambitious. I hope you're ready for the challenge. It's a tough world out there." The condescension in his voice was like a spark to kindling, igniting a quiet anger within her. "I'm ready," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "I've learned a lot about challenges, Victor, and about resilience." The air between them crackled, a silent battle of wills. Victor's smile faltered, and for a moment, she saw something raw in his expression, regret, perhaps, or something closer to fear. He wasn't used to this Eleanor, the one who didn't bend under his gaze, who didn't seek his approval. Before he could respond, Cassandra appeared at his side, her crimson gown a stark contrast to the tension in the air. "Victor, we're needed at the donor table," she said, her voice sharp, her eyes flicking to Eleanor with barely concealed hostility. "Eleanor, it's been enlightening to see you again." Eleanor nodded, her expression serene. "Likewise, Cassandra. Enjoy the rest of your evening." As Cassandra tugged Victor away, Eleanor felt a rush of relief, tempered by a lingering unease. She had held her ground, but the encounter had taken more out of her than she cared to admit. Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with pride. "Well done," she said softly. "You didn't just survive that. You owned it." Eleanor exhaled, a shaky breath that betrayed her calm facade. "I'm not sure I feel like I owned anything," she admitted. "But I didn't run." "That's more than enough," Beatrice said, her voice firm. "Now, come with me. There's someone else you need to meet. This night is far from over." As Beatrice led her toward another group, Eleanor felt the room's energy shift again, the whispers growing louder, the eyes more admiring. She was no longer just Victor Crestwell's ex-wife. She was Eleanor Vale, and she was writing her own story, one bold step at a time. The Crestwood Gala was a theater of egos, where every gesture was a line in a carefully scripted play. But as Eleanor Vale followed Beatrice Langston through the glittering crowd, she felt the script unraveling. The ballroom, with its chandeliers casting prisms of light and its air thick with the scent of orchids and ambition, was no longer Victor Crestwell's stage. Eleanor's presence, her emerald gown, her quiet defiance, her refusal to fade, had rewritten the evening's narrative. She could feel in the way heads turned, in the hushed murmurs that followed her, in the subtle shift of power that seemed to ripple outward from her every step. Beatrice led her to a small group near the grand staircase, where a handful of influential figures stood in a loose circle, their conversation punctuated by sharp laughter and the clink of glasses. Among them was Sophia Reyes, a renowned philanthropist and art collector whose name carried weight in both the social and cultural spheres. Sophia was in her late 40s, with jet black hair pulled into a sleek bun and a silver gown that shimmered like liquid mercury. Her eyes, sharp and perceptive, lit up as she saw Eleanor approach. "Eleanor Vale," Sophia said, her voice warm but commanding, cutting through the group's conversation. "I was hoping you'd be here tonight. You've been the talk of the evening." Eleanor felt a flush of warmth, tempered by the familiar pang of self-consciousness. "I didn't mean to steal the spotlight," she said, her tone light but sincere. "I just wanted to show up." "And you did more than that," Sophia replied, her smile genuine. "You've reminded us all what strength looks like. That gown alone is a statement." She gestured to Eleanor's emerald dress, its sequins catching the light like a constellation. "But it's what you're doing with it that matters. I heard you're planning an art gallery. Tell me more." The invitation caught Eleanor off guard, but the sincerity in Sophia's voice was disarming. She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the silver bracelet on her wrist for courage. "It's still in the early stages," she began, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I want to create a space for emerging artists, especially those who don't have access to the traditional gallery world. People with stories that deserve to be heard, raw, authentic voices. I'm thinking of a space that's not just about art, but about community, about giving people a chance to shine." Sophia's eyes gleamed with interest. "That's ambitious," she said, echoing Victor's earlier words but without the condescension. "And exactly what this city needs. The art world can be so insular, so elitist. A project like yours could shake things up. Have you considered partnerships? I know a few foundations that might be interested in funding something this visionary." Eleanor's heart quickened, a mix of excitement and disbelief. This was more than a polite conversation. It was a lifeline, a chance to turn her dream into reality. "I'd love to explore that," she said, her voice gaining confidence. "I'm still building the framework, but I'm open to ideas and support. Consider me your first investor," Sophia said, her tone firm. "Let's set up a meeting next week. Bring your plans, your sketches, everything. I want to see this come to life." The other members of the group nodded, their expressions a mix of curiosity and admiration. One of them, a young gallery owner named Liam Chun, chimed in. "I've seen your curatorial work, Eleanor. The Children's Hospital benefit a few years back. It was brilliant. You have an eye for what connects with people. I'd love to collaborate, maybe share some artists from my network." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of possibility she hadn't dared to hope for. These were not just words of encouragement. They were invitations, bridges to a future she was only beginning to imagine. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Overwhelmed in the best way." "Beatrice," who had been watching with a satisfied smile, leaned in. "You're not overwhelmed, my dear," she said softly. "You're unstoppable, and they're starting to realize it." She tilted her head toward the far side of the room, where Victor and Cassandra stood, their perfect facade cracking under the weight of the evening's shifting dynamics. Victor was trying to maintain his usual charm, laughing with a group of investors, but his eyes kept darting to Eleanor. Each glance was a mix of frustration and something deeper, regret, perhaps, or a recognition of the power he had lost. Cassandra, meanwhile, was floundering. Her attempt to spin the narrative at the auction table had backfired, and now she stood at Victor's side, her crimson gown a stark contrast to her strained expression. She was smiling, but it was a brittle, desperate thing, and the crowd was beginning to notice. The whispers were no longer about Eleanor's return. They were about Cassandra's faltering grip on the spotlight. Eleanor caught Victor's eye for a moment, and she saw something new in his gaze: vulnerability. It was a fleeting glimpse, quickly masked by his usual arrogance, but it was there. For the first time, she realized that he wasn't just angry or threatened. He was afraid. Afraid of losing the control he had always taken for granted. Afraid of the woman he had underestimated. The realization was both empowering and unsettling. Eleanor had spent so long seeing Victor as invincible, a force of nature who shaped the world to his will. But now, watching him struggle to maintain his composure, she saw a man, flawed and human, grappling with the consequences of his choices. It didn't erase the pain he had caused, but it shifted something within her, a loosening of the hold he had on her heart. "Eleanor," Sophia said, pulling her back to the conversation, "I want you to meet someone else. Daniel Moreau. He's a curator from Paris, in town for the gala. He's been looking for new talent to feature in an international showcase next spring. I think you two would have a lot to talk about." Before Eleanor could respond, a tall man in a tailored black suit approached, his dark hair streaked with silver and his eyes warm with curiosity. "Eleanor Vale," he said, his French accent softening the edges of his words. "Sophia speaks highly of you. I hear you're planning something revolutionary with your gallery." Eleanor smiled, her nerves tempered by the growing sense of purpose within her. "I'm trying," she said. "It's a dream, but I'm starting to believe it could be real." "It's already real," Daniel said, his tone earnest. "The moment you start dreaming with intention, it's real. I'd love to hear more, perhaps over coffee tomorrow. I'm here for a few days, and I'm always looking for voices that challenge the status quo." Eleanor nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and determination. "I'd like that," she said. "Thank you." As Daniel and Sophia continued the conversation, Beatrice leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "You're building an army, Eleanor," she said, her eyes gleaming. "And it's a beautiful thing to watch." Across the room, Victor watched the scene unfold, his hands clenched at his sides. Cassandra had returned to his side, her face a mask of barely contained fury. "This is getting out of hand," she hissed, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "She's turning this into her coronation, and we're looking like fools." Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. He was used to being the one who set the tone, who controlled the room. But tonight, Eleanor was the one drawing allies, forging connections, rewriting the story he had crafted so carefully. And for the first time in years, he felt the ground shifting beneath him. "We need to do something," Cassandra pressed, her voice rising with urgency. "She's stealing your spotlight, Victor. Our spotlight." Victor turned to her, his eyes cold. "Then take it back," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But do it carefully. She's not the woman we thought she was." Cassandra's eyes narrowed, a spark of defiance in her gaze. She nodded, a calculated smile curving her lips. "Fine," she said. "I'll make sure everyone remembers who's really in charge." As she turned and strode toward the stage, where the gala's keynote speech was about to begin, Victor felt a cold dread settle in his chest. Cassandra was a force, but she was reckless, and Eleanor was proving to be a far more formidable opponent than either of them had anticipated. The tide was turning, and for the first time, Victor wasn't sure he could stop it. The Crestwood Gala had reached its crescendo, the ballroom humming with anticipation as the crowd gathered near the stage for the keynote address. The chandeliers cast a golden glow over the sea of tailored suits and glittering gowns, but the air was thick with unspoken tension, a storm brewing beneath the surface of polite applause. Eleanor Vale stood near the edge of the crowd, flanked by Beatrice Langston and Sophia Reyes, her emerald gown a beacon of quiet defiance. She could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that the night was building toward something irreversible. Beatrice leaned in, her silver hair catching the light as she whispered, "Brace yourself, Eleanor. Cassandra's up to something. I can smell it." Her eyes flicked toward the stage, where Cassandra Leigh stood, her crimson gown a vivid slash against the neutral backdrop. She was speaking to the gala's MC, her gestures animated, her smile a calculated blend of charm and authority. Eleanor's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression serene, her fingers brushing the silver bracelet on her wrist for strength. "Let her try," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm not running." Sophia, standing on her other side, gave her a reassuring nod. "You've already changed the game tonight," she said. "Whatever she does, it's just noise. You're the signal." The words bolstered Eleanor, grounding her as the MC stepped to the microphone, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us at the Crestwood Foundation Gala. Tonight, we celebrate not only our shared commitment to philanthropy, but also the vision and leadership that drive our mission forward. Please welcome Cassandra Leigh, who will share a few words about our latest initiative." The crowd applauded politely, but Eleanor caught the undercurrent of curiosity, the whispers that had followed her all night, now shifting toward Cassandra. She ascended the stage with the grace of a predator, her crimson gown catching the spotlight like a flame. Her smile was radiant, but Eleanor saw the tension in her posture, the way her hands gripped the podium a little too tightly. Cassandra was fighting to reclaim the narrative, and Eleanor knew this moment was as much about her as it was about the foundation. "Thank you all for being here," Cassandra began, her voice smooth and confident, carrying the polished cadence of someone used to commanding a room. "The Crestwood Foundation has always been about building a better future, about supporting innovation and community. Tonight, I'm thrilled to announce our new initiative, a partnership with emerging tech startups to fund education programs for underserved youth." The crowd murmured in approval, and Cassandra's smile widened, her eyes scanning the room with practiced ease. But then her gaze landed on Eleanor, and for a fleeting moment, her composure faltered. It was a crack in her armor, so subtle most wouldn't notice, but Eleanor saw it. The flicker of insecurity, the spark of resentment. Cassandra recovered quickly, her smile sharpening as she continued. "This initiative is close to my heart," she said, her tone taking on a softer, almost confessional note. "As someone who's had to fight for every opportunity, I know what it means to rise above challenges, to rebuild after setbacks, to prove that you're more than what others expect of you." The words were carefully chosen, a veiled jab at Eleanor's presence, her setback of a divorce. The crowd didn't react overtly, but Eleanor felt the shift in the room, the way eyes darted between her and Cassandra. It was a power play, an attempt to paint herself as the resilient heroine, while casting Eleanor as the fragile past. Beatrice's hand tightened on Eleanor's arm, a silent gesture of support, but Eleanor didn't need it. She stood taller, her emerald gown shimmering, her expression unreadable. Cassandra pressed on, her voice gaining momentum. "I'm proud to stand here with Victor Crestwell, whose vision has always driven this foundation forward. Together, we're building something extraordinary, not just for today, but for generations to come." Victor stood near the front of the crowd, his face a mask of approval, but Eleanor caught the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked toward her. He was playing his part, but it was a performance, and the cracks were starting to show. Cassandra's speech was meant to solidify their image as a power couple, but it was also a desperate bid to reclaim the spotlight Eleanor had stolen. As Cassandra concluded, the crowd applauded, but it was a polite, restrained sound, lacking the fervor she had clearly expected. She descended the stage, her smile fixed, and made her way toward Victor, her movements deliberate, as if to underscore their unity. But the room's energy had shifted again, and Eleanor felt it, a tide turning in her favor. "That was bold," Sophia murmured, her voice laced with amusement. But it didn't land the way she hoped. Look at them. Eleanor followed her gaze. Cassandra had reached Victor, her hand on his arm, but their body language was off. Her grip too tight, his posture too rigid. The crowd was watching, not with admiration, but with a mix of curiosity and pity. The power couple was unraveling, and Eleanor's quiet presence was the catalyst. Before Eleanor could respond, Julian Harper appeared at her side, his expression one of quiet admiration. "You didn't even need to say a word," he said, his voice low. "You're winning this without lifting a finger." Eleanor shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'm not trying to win," she said. "I'm just here." "And that's enough," Julian replied, his eyes warm. "You're not just here, Eleanor. You're changing the room. Look at them. They're scrambling." Eleanor glanced at Victor and Cassandra again, catching the moment Cassandra leaned in to whisper something to him, her expression sharp and urgent. Victor's face darkened, his jaw tightening, as he nodded curtly. Whatever Cassandra was planning, it wasn't over yet. Beatrice, ever the strategist, leaned in. "They're rattled," she said, her voice gleeful. "But Cassandra's not done. She's going to try something else, something bigger. You need to be ready." Eleanor nodded, her heart steady despite the anticipation building within her. "I am," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. She thought of her gallery, of the women who had rallied around her, of the bracelet on her wrist. She wasn't just facing Victor and Cassandra. She was facing her own past, her own fears, and she was ready to stand her ground. As the crowd began to disperse, moving back to their tables for the gala's dinner service, a new figure approached Eleanor. It was Daniel Moreau, the French curator she had met earlier, his dark eyes warm with interest. "Eleanor," he said, his accent softening his words. "I couldn't help overhearing Cassandra's speech. It was ambitious, but your vision for the gallery, it's authentic. That's what resonates." Eleanor smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her. "Thank you, Daniel," she said. "I'm just starting to believe it myself." He tilted his head, studying her. "You should. I meant what I said about coffee tomorrow. I think your gallery could be part of something bigger, an international network of spaces for new voices. Let's talk more." The offer was another lifeline, another step toward the future she was building. Eleanor nodded, her heart swelling with possibility. "I'd like that," she said. "Tomorrow." As Daniel moved off to join another conversation, Beatrice gave Eleanor a knowing look. "You're not just rewriting your story," she said. "You're rewriting theirs. And they know it." Eleanor glanced across the room, where Victor and Cassandra were now seated at a prominent table, surrounded by donors but isolated in their tension. Cassandra's smile was a brittle mask, her eyes darting to Eleanor every few seconds. Victor's gaze was fixed on his plate, his expression unreadable but heavy with something Eleanor couldn't quite name. Regret, perhaps, or the dawning realization that he was no longer the center of the universe. The gala was far from over, and Eleanor knew the night held more challenges. But for the first time, she felt ready, not just to survive, but to thrive. She was Eleanor Vale, and the stage was hers. The Crestwood Gala's dinner service was a symphony of clinking crystal and murmured conversation, the ballroom's opulence amplified by the soft glow of candlelight on each table. Eleanor Vale sat at a table near the edge of the room, surrounded by Beatrice Langston, Sophia Reyes, and a few other allies she had reconnected with throughout the evening. Her emerald gown shimmered as she leaned forward to respond to a question about her gallery project, her voice steady but alive with passion. The women around her listened intently, their faces a mix of admiration and genuine interest, a stark contrast to the pity she had feared. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt like she belonged, not as Victor Crestwell's wife, but as herself, a woman with a vision and a voice. Across the room, Victor and Cassandra sat at the gala's most prominent table, surrounded by high-profile donors and corporate titans. Their position was a deliberate display of power, but the cracks in their facade were becoming impossible to ignore. Cassandra's crimson gown, once a bold statement, now seemed garish against the muted elegance of the room, her smile a brittle mask that faltered with every glance toward Eleanor's table. Victor's expression was a study in control, but his eyes betrayed him, darting to Eleanor with a mix of frustration and something deeper, regret, perhaps, or the dawning realization that he had misjudged her strength. Cassandra leaned toward Victor, her voice a low hiss barely audible over the hum of the crowd. "This is getting ridiculous," she said, her fingers gripping the stem of her wine glass. "She's turning this into her personal victory lap, and we're sitting here like props in her story." Victor's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on his plate, as if it could shield him from the truth in her words. "She's not doing anything," he said, his voice low and clipped. "She's just here." "That's the problem," Cassandra snapped, her eyes flashing. "She's here, and she's stealing everything we've worked for. The donors are talking about her gallery, not our initiative. The board members are fawning over her, not us. We need to shut this down, Victor. Now." Victor's eyes flicked to Eleanor's table, where she was laughing at something Sophia had said, her face radiant with a confidence he hadn't seen in years. The sight hit him like a physical blow, stirring memories he had buried deep. Memories of their early days, when her quiet strength had been his anchor, when her belief in him had fueled his ambition. He had convinced himself that she was holding him back, that her contentment was a chain on his soaring dreams. But now, watching her shine without him, he felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Possession, perhaps, or the bitter sting of loss. "We can't make a scene," he said finally, his voice cold but measured. "Not here. It'll only make things worse." Cassandra's smile was sharp, almost feral. "Then I'll do it quietly," she said, rising from her seat with a grace that belied her fury. "But I'm not letting her walk away with this night." Eleanor, unaware of the storm brewing at Victor's table, was caught up in the conversation with her newfound allies. Sophia was sharing details about a recent art acquisition, her enthusiasm infectious. "You'd love this piece, Eleanor," she said. "It's by a young sculptor from the Bronx. Raw, powerful, exactly the kind of voice your gallery could champion. I'd love to see it," Eleanor said, her heart swelling with possibility. The idea of her gallery was no longer just a dream. It was taking shape, fueled by the support of women like Sophia and Beatrice, who saw her not as a victim, but as a force. She glanced at her bracelet, its silver catching the candlelight, and felt a surge of gratitude for Margot, for Dr. Hart, for everyone who had helped her reach this moment. But the moment was interrupted by a shift in the room's energy, a subtle tightening of the air. Eleanor looked up to see Cassandra approaching, her crimson gown cutting through the crowd like a blade. Her smile was polished, but her eyes were cold, calculating, a predator sizing up her prey. Eleanor's heart quickened, but she kept her expression serene, her posture relaxed. She had faced Cassandra once tonight. She could do it again. "Eleanor," Cassandra said, her voice syrupy with false warmth as she reached the table. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I just want to say how inspiring it is to see you here, moving forward with your projects." The table fell silent, the women exchanging glances. Beatrice's eyes narrowed, her hand resting lightly on Eleanor's arm, a silent signal of support. Eleanor met Cassandra's gaze, her own eyes steady. "Thank you, Cassandra," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I appreciate that." Cassandra's smile tightened, her fingers adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist. A gift from Victor, no doubt, and a deliberate reminder of her place at his side. "I was just telling the donors about our new initiative," she said, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "It's such a bold step for the foundation, don't you think? Of course, you know all about bold steps with your little gallery idea." The condescension was unmistakable, a calculated attempt to diminish Eleanor in front of her allies. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She tilted her head, her smile faint but unyielding. "It's more than an idea," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It's a vision, and I'm finding that a lot of people share it." Sophia leaned forward, her silver gown catching the light. "Indeed," she said, her tone sharp but polite. "Eleanor's gallery is exactly the kind of project this city needs. Authentic, inclusive, groundbreaking. We were just discussing potential partnerships." Cassandra's smile faltered, her eyes flicking to Sophia with a flash of irritation. She hadn't expected resistance, not from someone of Sophia's stature. "That's wonderful," she said, recovering quickly. "I'm sure it'll be a lovely little venture. But the foundation's work is on a much larger scale, of course. Global impact, systemic change. That's what Victor and I are focused on. Eleanor felt a spark of anger, but she kept it in check, her expression serene. I'm sure it's impressive, she said. But sometimes the smallest projects have the biggest impact. It's about connection, not competition. The words hung in the air, a quiet rebuke that landed like a dart. The women around the table nodded subtly, their expressions a mix of admiration and amusement. Cassandra's smile froze, her eyes narrowing as she realized she was losing ground. The crowd was watching, their whispers growing louder, and for the first time, Cassandra felt the sting of being outmaneuvered. Before she could respond, Victor appeared at her side, his presence a silent command to retreat. "Cassandra," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We're needed at the donor table." Cassandra's eyes flashed with defiance, but she nodded, her smile a brittle mask. "Of course," she said, turning to Eleanor. "It was so nice to catch up, Eleanor. Best of luck with your vision." Eleanor nodded, her expression unruffled. "Thank you, Cassandra. Good luck with yours." As Victor and Cassandra retreated, the table erupted into quiet laughter, Beatrice's eyes gleaming with triumph. "That," she said, "was a masterclass in grace under fire. You didn't just hold your ground. You took theirs." Eleanor exhaled, a shaky breath that betrayed the effort it had taken to stay composed. "I don't know how I did that," she admitted, her voice soft. "But it felt good." "It should," Sophia said, her smile warm. "You're not just surviving tonight, Eleanor. You're rewriting the rules." Across the room, Victor steered Cassandra back to their table, his grip on her arm tight enough to bruise. "What the hell was that?" he hissed, his voice low but furious. "You're making us look desperate." Cassandra yanked her arm free, her eyes blazing. "I'm trying to save us," she snapped. "She's turning this into her night, Victor. Her comeback. And you're just standing there, letting it happen." Victor's face darkened, his control fraying at the edges. "She's not worth this," he said, but the words lacked conviction. He looked across the room at Eleanor, surrounded by allies, her emerald gown a symbol of her rebirth. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own choices, the cost of underestimating the woman he had left behind. The gala was reaching its breaking point, and the night was far from over. Eleanor stood at the center of it all, not as a victim, but as a force, a woman who had walked into the fire and emerged, not unscathed, but stronger. The Crestwood Gala was a glittering house of cards, its elegance built on fragile alliances and carefully curated facades. As the dinner service drew to a close, the ballroom hummed with a restless energy, the crowd sensing that the night was teetering on the edge of something seismic. Eleanor Vale stood near the arched windows, her emerald gown catching the candlelight as she listened to Sophia Reyes and Beatrice Langston discuss the logistics of her gallery project. Their voices were a steady anchor, but Eleanor could feel the storm brewing across the room, where Victor Crestwell and Cassandra Leigh sat, their perfect image unraveling like a tapestry pulled apart at the seams. Cassandra's failed attempt to reclaim the narrative during her keynote speech had left her visibly shaken, her crimson gown now seeming less like a statement of power and more like a desperate cry for attention. Victor, seated beside her, was a statue of controlled fury, his dark eyes fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She met his gaze for a moment, her expression calm but unyielding, a silent declaration that she was no longer his to control. The room noticed, the whispers had grown louder, the glances more overt. Eleanor Vale was no longer a footnote in Victor's story. She was the story. Beatrice leaned in, her silver hair gleaming as she whispered, "They're falling apart, Eleanor. You got them on the ropes without even trying." Eleanor shook her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I'm not trying to fight them," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm just trying to be me." "And that's why you're winning," Sophia said, her silver gown shimmering as she raised her glass in a subtle toast. "You're not playing their game. You're creating your own." Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion near the stage drew her attention. The MC had returned to the microphone, his voice bright but strained as he announced the evening's final event, a live auction to benefit the Foundation's new initiative. The crowd murmured with interest, but Eleanor's eyes were drawn to Cassandra, who had risen from her seat and was making her way toward the stage. Her crimson gown swayed with each deliberate step, her smile a polished mask that barely concealed the fire in her eyes. "She's not done," Beatrice said, her voice low and warning. "This is her last chance to take back the night. Be ready." Eleanor nodded, her heart quickening, but her resolve unshaken. She adjusted the silver bracelet on her wrist, its cool weight a reminder of her strength. She had faced Cassandra's barbs and Victor's condescension already. She could face whatever came next. Cassandra ascended the stage, her presence commanding despite the cracks in her composure. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth and confident, "thank you for your generosity tonight. The live auction is a highlight of the Crestwood Gala, and I'm thrilled to present a very special item, a private dinner with Victor Crestwell and myself, hosted at our penthouse, to discuss the future of innovation and philanthropy." The crowd applauded, but the enthusiasm was tepid, a far cry from the fervor Cassandra had expected. She pressed on, her smile tightening. "This is a unique opportunity to connect with the visionaries behind the Crestwood Foundation's groundbreaking work. Shall we start the bidding at $10,000? The room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Eleanor watched from her corner, her breath catching as she realized what Cassandra was doing. This was more than an auction item. It was a desperate bid to reassert their dominance, to remind the room that they were the power couple, the ones who mattered. But the silence stretched, unbroken by bids, and Cassandra's smile faltered, her eyes darting to Victor for support. Victor stood, his movements deliberate as he joined her on the stage, his charm a practiced weapon. "Come now," he said, his voice warm but edged with urgency. "This is for a good cause. Let's make it interesting. $15,000 to start." A hand rose from the crowd, a young tech mogul with a reputation for flashiness. $15,000, he called, his tone more performative than genuine. Another bid followed, then another, but the energy was lackluster, the crowd's attention drifting. Eleanor could feel it. The room was no longer theirs. It was hers. Cassandra's eyes scanned the crowd, landing on Eleanor with a flash of desperation. "Surely we can do better," she said, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "This is about the future, about impact. Let's not let distractions overshadow the real work being done here." The jab was unmistakable, and Eleanor felt the weight of every eye in the room. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she raised her hand, her movement slow and deliberate. $20,000, she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed in the silence. Cassandra's face froze, her eyes widening with shock. Victor's expression darkened, his hands clenching at his sides. Eleanor held their gazes, her emerald gown shimmering as she stood her ground. She wasn't bidding for the dinner. She had no intention of sitting across from Victor and Cassandra in their penthouse. She was bidding to make a point. She was here, she was unafraid, and she was done being erased. $20,000 from Eleanor Vale, the MC said, his voice tinged with surprise. "Do I hear $25,000? The silence stretched, heavy and charged. Cassandra's smile was a brittle thing, her eyes burning with fury as she looked at Victor, willing him to act. But Victor was frozen, his control slipping as the room watched, waiting. Finally, a voice from the back called out, $25,000, and the bidding continued, but the moment had shifted. Eleanor's bid had been a declaration, a line drawn in the sand, and the crowd knew it. Cassandra's composure cracked, her voice rising as she leaned into the microphone. "Let's keep the focus on the cause," she said, her tone sharp and desperate. "This isn't about personal vendettas. It's about making a difference." The words were a mistake, a public acknowledgement of the drama she had tried so hard to suppress. The crowd murmured, their whispers turning to a low buzz of speculation. Eleanor remained calm, her expression serene as she lowered her hand. She had made her point, and she didn't need to say another word. Victor stepped forward, his voice low as he addressed the MC. "Let's move on," he said, his tone clipped. "Next item." The MC nodded, quickly shifting to the next auction lot, but the damage was done. Cassandra's attempt to reclaim the narrative had backfired, and Victor's attempt to salvage it had only highlighted their desperation. As Cassandra descended the stage, her crimson gown a stark contrast to her pale, furious face, Victor followed, his jaw tight. The crowd parted for them, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and intrigue. The power couple, once untouchable, was crumbling, and Eleanor was the catalyst. Beatrice leaned in, her voice gleeful. "That was brilliant," she said. "You didn't just steal their thunder. You obliterated it." Eleanor exhaled, her heart still racing. "I didn't plan that," she admitted, her voice soft. "It just felt right." "It was more than right," Sophia said, her eyes gleaming with pride. "It was a power move. You showed them you're not just here, you're here to stay." Julian Harper, who had been watching from a nearby table, approached with a grin. "Eleanor, you're a force of nature," he said. "That bid was the talk of the night. You've got everyone rethinking who the real power is in this room." Eleanor smiled, a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration settling over her. "I'm just trying to keep up," she said, but there was a spark in her eyes, a growing confidence that hadn't been there at the start of the night. As the auction continued, Eleanor felt the room's energy shift irrevocably in her favor. Victor and Cassandra were still at the center of their table, but their light had dimmed, their crown shattered. Eleanor, in her emerald gown, was the new sun, and the room was orbiting around her. But the night wasn't over, and Eleanor knew that Cassandra's desperation could lead to something reckless. She braced herself, her heart steady, ready for whatever came next. She was Eleanor Vale, and she was no longer a ghost in her own story. The Crestwood Gala was winding down, its glittering surface fraying at the edges as the night reached its inevitable climax. The live auction had ended, leaving a buzz of excitement and speculation in its wake, but the true drama was unfolding away from the stage. Eleanor Vale stood near the arched windows, her emerald gown a radiant contrast to the muted elegance of the ballroom. The candlelight caught the sequins, casting tiny sparks that mirrored the fire in her heart. She had just turned the tide with her bold $20,000 bid, a move that had not only stolen the spotlight from Victor Crestwell and Cassandra Leigh, but had also exposed their crumbling facade to the entire room. Beatrice Langston, Sophia Reyes, and Julian Harper stood close by, their presence a quiet fortress of support. The whispers around them had shifted from curiosity to awe, the crowd now openly admiring Eleanor's transformation. She was no longer the fragile ex-wife, the discarded relic of Victor's past. She was Eleanor Vale, a woman who had walked into the lion's den and emerged as its queen. But the night wasn't over, and Eleanor could sense the storm still brewing. Cassandra's desperation was palpable, a live wire sparking in the air. Victor's control, once unshakable, was unraveling, his dark eyes following Eleanor with a mix of resentment and something softer, regret, perhaps, or a longing for what he had lost. Eleanor felt it too, the weight of their shared history, but she refused to let it pull her under. She was here for herself, and she would not falter now. Across the room, Cassandra stood alone for a moment, her crimson gown a stark contrast to the crowd's subdued elegance. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her polished smile gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded fury. She had tried everything: her keynote speech, her barbed comments, her attempt to dominate the auction, and still, Eleanor had outshone her. The room was no longer hers, and the realization was a bitter pill she couldn't swallow. Victor approached her, his expression a storm of barely contained anger. "You need to stop," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're making this worse." Cassandra whirled on him, her eyes blazing. "I'm making it worse?" she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You're the one who let her waltz in here and take everything. You said she was nothing, Victor, a shadow, a nobody. But look at her." She gestured toward Eleanor, her hand trembling with rage. "She's stealing our night, our future, and you're just standing there." Victor's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. "She's not stealing anything," he said, but the words lacked conviction. He looked at Eleanor, surrounded by allies, her emerald gown a symbol of her rebirth, and felt a cold knot of dread in his chest. He had built his empire on control, on shaping the world to his will, But Eleanor was rewriting the rules, and he was powerless to stop her. Cassandra's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint in them. "If you won't fix this, I will," she said, her voice low and venomous. She turned and strode toward Eleanor, her crimson gown slicing through the crowd like a blade. The room sensed the shift, conversations faltering as eyes turned to follow her. It was a moment of reckoning, and everyone knew it. Eleanor saw her coming, her heart quickening, but her resolve unshaken. Beatrice's hand tightened on her arm, a silent warning, but Eleanor shook her head slightly. "I've got this," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She stepped forward, meeting Cassandra halfway, her emerald gown shimmering under the chandeliers. The crowd parted, creating a small arena for their confrontation, the air thick with anticipation. "Eleanor," Cassandra said, her voice loud enough to carry, her smile a thin veneer over her fury. "I think it's time we had a real conversation. No games, no pretense. Just you and me." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but unyielding. "I'm listening," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the murmurs around them. "What do you want to say, Cassandra?" Cassandra's smile faltered, her eyes flashing with desperation. She had expected Eleanor to back down, to retreat under the weight of her presence. But Eleanor stood tall, her emerald gown a shield, her silver bracelet a talisman. "You're putting on quite a show tonight," Cassandra said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But let's be honest, this isn't you. This isn't your world anymore. You're clinging to a past that doesn't exist, and it's sad." The words were meant to wound, to paint Eleanor as a desperate relic, but they fell flat. The crowd watched, their whispers dying down, their eyes fixed on Eleanor. She felt the weight of their gaze, but it wasn't heavy. It was empowering. She took a step closer to Cassandra, her voice low but clear, carrying the weight of her newfound strength. "Sad," Eleanor repeated, her tone measured but sharp. "The only thing sad here is your need to tear me down to feel better about yourself. I'm not clinging to anything, Cassandra. I'm building something new, something real, and I don't need to step on anyone to do it." The crowd gasped softly, the words landing like a thunderclap. Cassandra's face paled, her smile collapsing into a grimace. She opened her mouth to respond, but Eleanor wasn't done. "You and Victor can keep your spotlight," she said, her voice steady, her eyes locked on Cassandra's. "I don't want it. I'm here for me, for my future, for the people who believe in me. And that's more than enough." The room was silent, the air charged with the weight of Eleanor's words. Cassandra stood frozen, her crimson gown a stark contrast to her ashen face. She had expected to crush Eleanor, to reassert her dominance, but instead, she had exposed her own desperation. The crowd saw it, the philanthropists, the investors, the influencers, and their eyes shifted to Eleanor, their admiration palpable. Victor, standing at the edge of the crowd, watched the scene unfold, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He wanted to step in, to salvage the situation, but he knew it was too late. Eleanor had claimed the night, not through manipulation or spectacle, but through authenticity, through the quiet power of her presence. For the first time, he saw her not as the woman he had left, but as the woman she had become, strong, radiant, unstoppable. Cassandra's hands trembled, her voice rising in a last, desperate attempt to regain control. "You think you can just walk back in here and take everything," she said, her words sharp but unsteady. "You're nothing without him, Eleanor. Nothing." Eleanor's smile was small, almost pitying. "I was never nothing," she said softly. "And I don't need him, or you, to prove it." The crowd erupted into murmurs, a wave of approval washing over the room. Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "Well said," she whispered, her hand resting lightly on Eleanor's shoulder. Sophia and Julian joined her, their presence a wall of support, a testament to the alliances Eleanor had forged. Cassandra turned to Victor, her eyes pleading for him to intervene, but he remained silent, his expression unreadable. The weight of his silence was crushing, a final blow to Cassandra's crumbling facade. She turned and fled the ballroom, her crimson gown trailing behind her like a wounded animal retreating from battle. Victor watched her go, his shoulders slumping slightly, the fight draining out of him. He looked at Eleanor one last time, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and resignation. Then he turned and followed Cassandra, disappearing into the crowd. The room exhaled, the tension breaking like a wave. Eleanor stood still, her heart pounding, but her spirit soaring. She had faced her past, her pain, and she had emerged not just intact but triumphant. The crowd began to move again, conversations resuming, but the energy was different now. Lighter, brighter, centered on her. Beatrice squeezed her arm, her voice warm with pride. "You did it," she said. "You didn't just survive them. You redefined them." Eleanor smiled, a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration washing over her. "I just wanted to be here," she said, her voice soft but strong. "But I think I found something more." "You found yourself," Sophia said, her silver gown catching the light as she raised her glass. "And that's the greatest victory of all." As the gala drew to a close, Eleanor felt the weight of the night settle around her, not as a burden, but as a crown. She was Eleanor Vale, and she was no longer a ghost in her own story. The future was hers, and it was radiant. The Crestwood Gala was fading into its final moments, the ballroom's golden light softening as the crowd began to disperse. The chandeliers cast long shadows across the marble floor, and the string quartet played a gentle, wistful melody that seemed to carry the weight of the night's revelations. Eleanor Vale stood near the grand staircase, her emerald gown still shimmering, though the sequins now felt less like armor and more like a celebration of the woman she had become. The air was lighter now, the tension that had gripped the room replaced by a quiet hum of resolution. Eleanor had faced her past, her pain, and the people who had tried to erase her, and she had emerged not just whole but radiant. Beatrice Langston, Sophia Reyes, and Julian Harper stood nearby, their presence a warm reminder of the alliances she had forged. They were sipping the last of their drinks, their conversation a mix of laughter and plans for the future, Eleanor's future. The whispers that had followed her all night had softened into murmurs of admiration, the crowd now openly acknowledging her as the night's true victor. Victor Crestwell and Cassandra Leigh had left shortly after their public unraveling, their exit a silent admission of defeat. Eleanor had watched them go, a complex mix of relief and closure settling over her. They were no longer her story. They were merely a chapter she had closed. "Eleanor," Sophia said, her silver gown catching the fading light as she turned to her. "Tonight was a triumph, but it's just the beginning. Your gallery, it's going to change things. I meant what I said about investing. Let's make it happen." Eleanor smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude and possibility. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I've got sketches, a business plan, a vision. I just need to take the next step." "And you will," Beatrice said, her eyes gleaming with pride. "You've already taken the hardest one. Walking in here tonight, facing them, facing yourself. The rest is just logistics." Julian nodded, his salt and pepper hair catching the light as he raised his glass. "To Eleanor Vale," he said, his voice warm and resonant. The woman who didn't just reclaim her story but rewrote it. The small group clinked glasses, the sound a quiet celebration in the midst of the gala's winding down. Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of belonging she hadn't known she could feel again. These were her people, not because of wealth or status, but because they saw her, believed in her, and stood by her when she needed it most. As the quartet played its final notes, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the journey that had brought her here. 18 months ago, she had been a shadow of herself, locked in the silence of her penthouse, her identity buried under the weight of Victor's betrayal. She had spent countless nights replaying their marriage, searching for the moment she had lost herself. But Dr. Hart had been right. Reclaiming her space wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a future that was hers alone. The emerald gown, the silver bracelet, the gallery dream, they were all pieces of that future, symbols of a woman who had found her voice. "Eleanor," a voice called softly, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Daniel Moreau, the French curator, his dark eyes warm with sincerity. "I'm heading back to Paris tomorrow, but I meant what I said about your gallery. It could be part of something bigger, an international network of spaces for new voices. I'll email you the details, but I hope you'll consider it." Eleanor nodded, a spark of excitement igniting within her. "I will," she said. "Thank you, Daniel, for seeing what I'm trying to do." He smiled, a quiet acknowledgement of her strength. "It's not just what you're doing," he said. "It's who you are. Keep shining, Eleanor." As Daniel moved off to say his goodbyes, Eleanor turned to the arched windows, the city's skyline glittering beyond like a promise. She thought of Margot, who had sent her that encouraging text before the gala, and Dr. Hart, who had guided her through the darkness. She thought of the artists she would champion, the stories she would help tell, the community she would build. The gallery was no longer just a dream. It was a reality taking shape, fueled by the connection she had made tonight and the strength she had found within herself. Beatrice joined her at the window, her navy gown a quiet contrast to Eleanor's emerald. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Eleanor took a deep breath, the city's lights blurring into a mosaic of possibility. "I'm thinking about tomorrow," she said, "and all the days after that. I spent so long feeling like my story was over, but tonight, I realized it's just beginning." Beatrice's smile was warm, almost maternal. "It's a hell of a beginning," she said, "and I can't wait to see where it takes you." As the last guest began to drift toward the exit, Eleanor felt a sense of peace settle over her. The gala had been a battlefield, a stage, a crucible, but it had also been a rebirth. She had walked in as Eleanor Vale, the woman who had been discarded, and she was leaving as Eleanor Vale, the woman who had reclaimed her power, her purpose, her future. She stepped toward the grand staircase, her heels clicking softly against the marble, her emerald gown trailing behind her like a comet's tail. The crowd parted, their eyes filled with respect, admiration, and a touch of awe. She didn't need their approval, but it felt good to know she had earned it, not as Victor's wife, but as herself. Outside, the night air was cool against her skin, the city's pulse a steady rhythm that matched her own. Henry, her driver, was waiting by the car, his face lighting up as he saw her. "You look like you conquered the world, Ms. Vale," he said, opening the door for her. Eleanor smiled, a quiet, radiant thing. "Not the world, Henry," she said, sliding into the car. "Just my corner of it." As the car pulled away from the Crestwood Hotel, Eleanor looked back at the glowing facade, a place that had once been her prison and was now her proving ground. Victor and Cassandra were gone, their empire shaken, but Eleanor didn't feel triumph over their downfall. She felt something deeper, freedom. The freedom to write her own story, to build a life that was hers alone. In her mind's eye, she saw the gallery, a space filled with color, light, and voices that had been silenced for too long. She saw herself at its center, not as a figurehead, but as a creator, a catalyst, a woman who had turned her pain into purpose. The road ahead would be challenging, but she was ready. She was Eleanor Vale, and her story was just beginning.